I'm just going to take you through it, but as I said, we're a small group, so feel free to interrupt at any time. So the title of the paper, we had an earlier paper called Lives and Livelihoods, and we decided to go to the downside of that, which is death and destitution. And the paper is looking at the global distribution of welfare losses from the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's joint work with Olivier Sturck, who is at Oxford, and Daniel Mahler and Benoit de Cerf, who are at the World Bank. So for some reason I can't move the screen here, which is odd. There. So the basic idea of the paper is to try and quantify, and to quantify we must compare losses in well-being arising from these two channels of the pandemic. So the pandemic is, of course, primarily a health and a mortality crisis. So here you have this left-hand side picture. But it also has huge economic costs, and those economic costs in particular translated into a considerable increase in poverty and destitution, particularly, as we'll find out, in the developing world. So here we've got a protest from workers in Colombia saying we're hungry. And if you Google, are we going to die of coronavirus or hunger in Google, you find a lot there. So this was a debate that people were having during the entire pandemic, and you know, as you know, various presidents and heads of state and so on were debating the relative costs of lives and livelihoods, of health and economics. And here we're not going to look at all of the health costs or all of the economic costs, but we're going to try to look at, in some sense, the extreme health costs, which are those when people die, mortality, and the extreme economic costs, which arise when people enter poverty, okay? So a very standard outline of the presentation, just an introduction, a short conceptual framework. So there'll be 2 slides with a few equations in them, but that's just to sort of anchor what we're doing on a little bit of theory, of sort of welfare theory. Then I'll talk about the 2 ingredients of my comparisons: life years lost to the pandemic and poverty years added by the pandemic. And then try to address the 2 main questions of the paper: the relative importance of these 2 costs, right? The relative importance of these 2 figures over here, and then their global distribution around the world, before concluding and discussing some limitations and caveats of the work. So to sort of elaborate a little bit on what I've already been saying, the paper has 2 main questions. The first one is looking at the relative importance, the relative contributions of increased mortality and higher poverty. Does that relative contribution vary across countries or types of countries? There are some countries where mortality is by far the dominant cause of welfare loss, whereas in others, maybe poverty is the dominant cause of welfare loss. And this was a question that was of interest to us, particularly as development economists, with the perception that perhaps the poverty costs were more important in poor countries than in richer countries, without prejudging where the mortality costs might be greater. So that was one of our motivations. Now, if you talk about the relative contributions, then the next step is naturally to say, well, can we aggregate those 2? If we find a unit, can we aggregate the mortality and poverty costs and see how that aggregate combination of the welfare losses is distributed across countries? Of course, the challenge for doing that, and there are many papers on this issue of combining economic costs with the costs of lives lost to the pandemic, is that they are typically expressed in different units. Economic costs are typically expressed in dollars or pounds or pesos or reais, and mortality costs are typically measured in the numbers of lives lost. And to combine them, economists have a number of traditional tools, including valuation of statistical lives and other methods. Our approach here is an attempt to bypass approaches that, quote unquote, put a price on human life. In part because, and my co-authors felt quite strongly about this, because those approaches seem to hit a wall in terms of public debates. There was a quote we had in the earlier paper by Andrew Cuomo, I forget, Cuomo, the current governor of New York, who said, you know, what's the price of a human life? A human life has no price, period, right? Or something like that. And in the public debate, to introduce numbers that say, well, a human life is worth these many dollars is often a problematic thing. So we do have a model which is, or our approach is based or anchored on a very simple social welfare model. So there is, you know, some economic theory behind it. And it is a model that is based on aggregations of expected lifetime utility, much in the same way as rather famous models of this, like Becker, Philipson, and Suarez in the AER and others. But we use that model to shift the metric from money as a unit to years of human life as a unit of measuring the welfare costs. And I'll detail how we do that in a moment. There is, as I'm sure you are familiar, you know, a lot of different papers on looking at poverty costs and economic costs of the pandemic. I want to mention three that are very, you know, just the three most immediately related to ours. This one is actually, the first paper here is by the same four authors. So it's Benoit, Olivier, Daniel, and myself. It's our earlier paper, which had the Lives and Livelihoods title. And so this is actually a follow-up to that paper, but it's different in a number of ways. So one way in which it's different is that in that paper, we never looked at the aggregate question. So we never looked at this question 2 here. We did look at question 1, but we never looked at question 2. And when we looked at question 1, we had data up to June 2020. And of course, since June 2020, unfortunately, the pandemic has continued and in many cases gotten worse. And so the data has changed a lot. And now we update that to December 2020, which is the data that we use in this paper. And there are some other differences between the two papers. But, it actually turns out that it's a much more different paper to the first one than I thought it was going to be when we were asked to write it. They're also related to this paper by Jean-Marie Balin. Benoit is a co-author here. That's where the original idea of using poverty years and life years was proposed by those authors. This is forthcoming in AEJ Applied. And the way we deal with forecasting poverty or estimating poverty in 2020, combining household survey data and measures or forecasts of growth in the national account, is inspired by this paper by Lackner et al. And Daniel Mahler, who's our co-author on this paper, is also a co-author on that paper. So just acknowledging those debts there. So let me now, you know, I'm sure some of you will love math, some of you will not. I'll just spend like a few minutes on this, and it's really just the basic ideas that are important, and they're very simple. And I'm going to start using life years and poverty years in a moment. And I just want to show you that those quantities are interpretable in terms of a very simple model of social welfare. Okay. So what we have here is just a simple utilitarian model of welfare, which builds on individual utility. And individual utility is just an expected lifetime utility. So it's the utility of that individual at time t from today until they die. Okay, and that instantaneous utility function, for simplicity, will depend only on the status S, of which there are 3. You could be dead, you could be poor, or you could be non-poor. Okay, so it's as if it depended on income, but I'm doing this step function thing where you depend, you know, you're either dead or poor or non-poor, and that is going to be important for allowing us to do what we want to do. So it's a sort of simplified version of a utility function of income. And then you aggregate that across individuals. You've got a standard social welfare function, Bentham 1. No aversion to inequality here. So 2 things you see here. There's no time discounting, no aversion to inequality. Those do matter for what we do. And in the end, I'll discuss some implications of that. So then the pandemic comes along. This looks scarier than it is, but the pandemic comes along. So we're now going to compare things under the pandemic, which is with the prime, to a counterfactual without the pandemic. So this is the difference in individual utility from the pandemic. And in our model, it can arise from 2 sources. You could die earlier. There could be premature mortality. So if you die earlier, if you die at D prime I instead of at DI, you lose this bit of utility here for those years that you lost. You could also, because of the economic shock, there was a contraction in GDP per capita in the world last year of 5.3%. And 172 out of the 182 countries for which there is data had a contraction in GDP per capita this year compared to 2019. Sorry, last year, 2020 compared to. So you can be made poorer for some periods between now and when you die. And this indicator function takes the value 1 if you were non-poor, and would have been non-poor in the absence of the pandemic, but you are poor with the pandemic. And then you lose this amount over here. So this is a sort of loss from periods spent in poverty, additional periods spent in poverty. And this is the loss from premature mortality. Okay. This thing is just the difference in utility if you're poor and non-poor. And this thing is just, if you die, you're given this utility here. You could have a discussion about whether poor people should be given lower utility. We ruled that out. We just give anyone who dies the same amount of utility. You've lost a chunk because you went to 0 utility. So this is individual utility. You add that all up across everybody, like we had before, and it just comes out of the math that you've got these 2 terms, right? So these is going to be, so there's a delta UP here. Notice that delta UD, we're going to assume is bigger than delta UP. So this loss from dying is greater than the loss of becoming poor. That means that you could write this as alpha times delta UP, which is greater than, with alpha greater than 1. So you could write all this in terms of delta UP, pull the delta UP out, and what have you got? You've got over here, basically a sum of times when you were, for each individual I, the number of years that he or she lost to mortality times this number alpha. So this is the life years lost. It's just across everybody who did die, how many years did they lose from dying earlier? And from this side, you've got how many years did people spend in poverty? Okay. So that's what you get. You just get that your change in welfare is going to be proportional to the number of years of life lost to the sum of the number of years of life that were lost, and the number of years that people are spending on poverty that they otherwise wouldn't have spent.
Excuse me, Fernando.
Yes.
Yeah, this is David.
Yes.
So it seems that definitionally, poverty is, if poverty is changeable, right? It's temporally bounded, and you're only measuring 1 year, right? So if a person is non-poor and becomes poor during the pandemic, they may revert to being non-poor very quickly after the pandemic. Whereas if they die, they're not going to revert to being alive. So I'm just curious how you estimate poverty over time. And death is fairly straightforward, but poverty is not, because people may be temporarily poor, but may go back to being poor quite quickly.
No, that's a good question. So in the theory here, if I'm allowing people to go in or out of poverty as many years as you like, right? And this is just going to take a value 1. So if somebody is poor for 3 years, this is going to take a value 1 in 2021, in 2022, in 2023, and then it will be 0. So I'm going to add 3 times that. Somebody else was poor for 5 years, I'm going to add 5 years here. Somebody else was poor for just 1 year, it's just going to be 1 year, right? So in principle, in the theory, I'm allowing exactly for this point that you're making, that people can go in and out of poverty. And in the theory, I'm just going to assign a delta UP loss if they are poor and otherwise would have been non-poor. So also if they otherwise would have been poor, I'm not going to add anything. It's just additional years of poverty, right? Now, in a few slides from now, I'll tell you that in practice, obviously we don't observe the future. So in practice, I'm going to assume that each person who becomes poor in 2020 spends just 1 year in poverty, 2020. Okay? So I'll come back to that in a moment.
Chico, I have also a question.
Sure, go ahead.
So, first of all, your utility from being alive or dead does not depend at all on your level of poverty, right?
So let me just answer that straight away, and then I know you're going to carry on. So there are these three levels of utility, right? So it does depend. I mean, if you're alive, you could be poor and you get this much, or you could be non-poor and you get that much. But when you die, we could have said, well, if you die and you're poor, your loss of utility is
Still the
P
same.
minus 0. And if you're non-poor, it's going to be UNP minus 0. So that would have entailed attributing a different value to the life of poor.
Yeah. And you've said that you're not going to do that. So.
And we don't do that. So then it's just that. Yeah.
Okay. The second thing is that your probability of dying is going to increase if you're poor.
Okay. So in the next few slides, I'm going to tell you how I calculate or estimate these things, which will take that into account. Okay. So in the model, I don't say why you die or why you don't die. You know, if you die, I count all the years that you would have lived as a loss. Okay. When I show you how I'm going to show you in the next couple of slides how we estimate these two things, and hopefully that will answer your question. But we can come back to that if it doesn't. Is that okay? All right. So this whole thing was to say it's a plausible way to look at changes in welfare to add up some weighted sum of years lost, which I'm going to call life years, and years added to poverty years. Of course, with a weight that weighs life years more than poverty years, because the utility of dying, right, is the loss in utility from dying is greater than the loss of utility. So a key thing is going to be what is alpha, right? And so alpha is this key normative parameter here that captures the trade-off. It's a social marginal rate of substitution between a life year relative to a poverty year. We like to think of it as what the answer would be in a population, perhaps the average answer or some aggregate answer over the population to the following question. How many years of your remaining life would you be willing to live in poverty in order to add one more year to your lifespan? So I'd like to ask you now, because you're my first victim audience to this paper, to think of that question and write the answer down on a piece of paper. And if you can, later on, if you have a moment, send it to me, because we're doing unscientific surveys of what people may think about this number. So the question is, you yourself personally, how many years would you say, if you guarantee to me, you're having a dialogue with God here, God guarantees one extra year at the end of your life, but he wants you to live in poverty for a few years between now and then. How many would you be prepared to do? Of course, this will change. This will depend on preferences. This will depend on how far from the poverty line you are. This will depend on a whole bunch of things. I'm asking you to think.
Doesn't it also depend on your age?
Sure. It depends on how much life left you have. Absolutely. So which is why, again, you take some aggregate, right? Kids will answer the question. Now, we don't do a survey here, so we're going to be agnostic about alpha. At the very end, I'll give you a range of values of alpha, but there is an intense debate amongst the co-authors on what that range should be. For much of the presentation, I will not present any alpha to you. I'm just going to present PYs and LYs. And depending on your alpha, you'll be able to make assessments about the relative importance of these things in a way that will become clear in a moment. So let me now turn to how we compute the ingredients, so the LYs and the PYs. And in doing so, hopefully I'll already address some of Martin's questions. So to calculate life years, we use data on demographic structures from the UN Population Division and data on COVID mortality from the Global Burden of Disease data. Now, in principle, what you do is you have a whole bunch of deaths at age A in country J. We're going to sum that all up. If you're 100 or more, you'll be lumped together with the 99-year-olds. But we have DAJ, DAJ, deaths at age A in country J, and you multiply each death by the residual life expectancy. So the life expectancy in country J, conditional of being of age A. If you're 65, then how many years on average do people in that country live longer? Okay. The number of deaths is, of course, the age-specific mortality rate times the number of people who are that age in your country. So this is just each death times the number of years that people in that country are expected to live. Okay, this is probably, you might think of this as introducing some upward bias if you worry that people who die from COVID are not the average people at that age, right? So you might say, well, at each age, people who survive COVID will be a little bit healthier. So maybe actually the number of years of life lost should be a little bit less than that, maybe, right? On the other hand, there's maybe some underestimates in reporting in many countries. So give or take, that's what we have. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but the point is, the problem is that you don't actually observe the age-specific mortality rate of COVID in many countries. You do in some, but not in the 145 that we have in our sample. So we have to do some work, okay? So in practice, what we observe for most countries is just the aggregate mortality rate across the whole population, not the age-specific one. So to get to our estimate, we have to make an assumption, and that is that the infection rate in country J is independent of age, not the mortality rate, just the infection rate, phi J. If you have that and you had the infection fatality ratio, this is an identity. This just says the number of deaths and the number of deaths. The number of deaths is, you know, the MAJ was here. I don't have the A, so I put the M over here. This is the total population times the mortality ratio from COVID. So that's the number of deaths from COVID. Here's the same thing, but here, instead of the mortality ratio, I have decomposed the mortality ratio into its two components, the infection rate and the death rate conditional on being infected, which is the infection fatality ratio. This number also isn't observed for a whole lot of countries, but when we started this work, you had estimates for France, which we impute to all high-income countries. And we had estimates from China, which we impute to all other countries, low and middle-income countries. If you make those two assumptions, that this thing is constant and, you know, imputing these IFRs from these two countries to these other countries, you are able to solve this thing for phi J. You plug it back in here using the same infection fatality rates, and then you have an estimate of the age-specific mortality ratio, or rate, rather, sorry, the age-specific mortality rate in country J, which you plug back into this equation, and that generates your life years for country J. Okay, so the bits here that may have been complicated are all about the data that we don't have and how we have to make some assumptions to get to it. The basic point that you should remember is we have the number of deaths at each age, and we're valuing each of those deaths at the number of years lost as the sort of residual life expectancy in that country, okay? So one difference between what we do and some other work that you will look where you just have the number of lives is that here we're counting the death of a young person as being worth many more years than the death of another person. Not because his or her life has different value, just because our metric is life years, okay? All right. So now we have these LYJs, okay? And we can plot them against GDP per capita, controlling for population. So here we've got LY per 100,000 people, years of life lost per 100,000 people. And here you've got GDP per capita. Both axes are on a log scale, okay? And you see this massive slope here, particularly amongst the low income. So the blue are low income, the green are lower middle income, orange are upper middle income, and the red are high income countries. There are 145 of them. This is in log scale. So this is telling you that there's around 10 life years lost per 100,000 people in the poorer countries. That's 1 year for 10,000 people. Whereas up here, you know, it's more like 500, 600 years, and at the top, 1,000 years per 100,000 people. So 1 year of life lost per 100 people in the population, right? So since this is an audience that is interested in Brazil, here's Brazil at the top, together with Peru and Mexico and Belgium and the US. 1,000 years of life lost per 100,000 people. Here's Thailand at the same level of GDP per capita, a little bit actually higher. You know, when I was a kid, Thailand was a lot poorer than Brazil, but this is what happens if you don't grow and other people grow, so they get richer than you. And nonetheless, although they have the sort of similar income per capita here, notice that the mortality burden from COVID measured in this way is 1,000 times greater in Brazil than it is in Thailand. And maybe what, 400, it's hard to tell because this is in log scale, right? But 400, 300 times bigger than in China. Okay. Okay, so that's one ingredient, that's life years, right? Let me tell you a little bit about why this looks this way. Why this burden is so much greater in richer countries than it is in poorer countries. Well, it's driven primarily by a very well-known fact that everyone on this call knows, which is that mortality, COVID mortality, is highly age selective, right? It's highly concentrated amongst the old. This is a graph from Sweden, where you've got people's ages and the number of deaths. It's not the mortality rate, it's the number of deaths. So if it was the mortality rate, it would be the 90 to 99 would be even higher, right? But there are fewer people there. So this is just a histogram of the number of deaths. And you see it's highly selective on older people. And that's true in Sweden, and that's true everywhere else as well. Okay. Now, given that COVID is very selective on old age, and given that the number of life years, remember, here's my number of life years, right? So mechanically, the number of life years is going to depend on these three things. And here are those three graphs. So this is the number of people at each age group. I'm showing you here one representation of that, the share of the population over 65. And you can see that whereas in the low income countries, there's about 3 to 4% of their population is in that range, that 65 plus range, there's only 3 or 4% of the population. In higher income countries, it's 20%, you know, ranging from 15 to 28% in Japan or whatever. Okay, so it's just a lot more old people, and COVID kills them more, and so that's a big deal. In addition to this, the mortality at each age does vary as well, but this graph is one that you should treat very, very carefully. So remember that we don't actually observe this thing. So the reason you've got this jump over here is that infection fatality rate from China is different than the infection fatality rate from China is different from the infection fatality rate in France in June. Okay, so this is driving this thing, and I don't know. And here it's actually very, very flat, right? This does matter again. So this is, you know, how many old people there are in these countries, and this is the fact that conditional on being a certain age, your life expectancy is higher in richer countries too. So if you do take a 70-year-old in Niger, it is, you know, he or she is expected to live shorter than a 70-year-old in Japan. So the life expectancies themselves at 65 are increasing. Okay, so this is kind of, these two graphs here are kind of why there is this shape. COVID is highly age selective in who it kills. There are a lot more older people in these countries, and they lose more years when they die because their life expectancy is high. All right. What about poverty? So we don't observe poverty in 2020 yet. No, the household surveys haven't gone out. What we do have is income distributions aligned at 2019 in that marvelous database that Martin Arvelian and co-authors created at the World Bank, this PovCalNet database. We have these income distributions, which are either from 2019 or they come from earlier and they're updated to 2019 in some way. So that's the 2019 distribution. Then I'm going to just move that distribution to 2020 in two ways. One, what people expected would have happened in January when macroeconomists had heard of COVID as this small little virus in faraway Wuhan. Okay, didn't think about it at all. And the word is this GDP forecasts. And you take the 2019 distribution, you multiply it for the growth rate predicted here, and you get this little blue line over here. Then in October, that's 3 months ago or 4 months ago, the only thing anyone talked about was COVID, and the forecasts for 2020 were dramatically different. It was almost the end of 2020, so there must be some real truth to this forecast, okay? You multiply the same distribution, everybody in the same distribution, by this growth rate, and you get this. So of course, actually it's the growth rate times 0.85 because there's a pass-through between GDP per capita growth and growth in the mean of the household survey. This is an average, goes back to the work of Ravadian and co-authors and so on and so forth. Of course, when we're doing this, we are assuming that the recession is distribution neutral. In our earlier paper, we did some sensitivity testing with changes in inequality, but those are really guesswork. So, do we think the distribution was neutral? No, but it's easier to show you this is an assumption of distribution of neutral. You can imagine, you can sort of play around with the recession distribution if you like. So this is distribution. And here's the answer to David's first question. Of course, we don't know how long poverty will last for these people. Some of them who are, leaving school earlier now may be in poverty for a very long time because they had evasion they were hit at a very critical year by this, or they were joining the labor market in 2020. Then, the consequences are likely to last for a while. There may be, insults to nutrition amongst poor people in the developing world, and we don't know what they're going to do to poverty in the future. Those are not here at all. All that we have here is we're taking that distribution from 2020 January estimate and shifting it back by the difference in the growth rates in the two forecasts. And so, you had this area B was going to be the poverty, this number here, and now it's kind of A plus B minus this tiny little blob here, right? So it's this area here is going to be your poverty, and that difference is the poverty years gain. Okay. Of course, how many poverty years you are assuming people are going to get depends on the poverty line that you choose. And we're looking at the whole world here. So we do two things. You could do many things. In fact, we've done some others, but we report two things, two exercises. One, a constant absolute poverty line. We take 190, which is the World Bank's international poverty line for extreme poverty. Okay. And then what you see is the opposite pattern to what we had with life years, right? Life years, were a bigger burden amongst richer countries. Poverty years at this poverty line is a much bigger burden poorer countries. And, the numbers are impressive. I mean, we're getting here, towards the region of, almost 1 in 10, let's say maybe, 1 in 20 or 1 in 50, 1 year, moving into poverty, right? So it's going to be 1 year because it's one person, we take it 1 year. But this is, like 1 in 50 people. This would be 1 in 100. This is 1 in 10. So yeah, 1 in 50, 40, whatever people in this country is moving into poverty. Okay, at this extreme line, much less, of course, amongst the richer countries, straight downward sloping relationship. Now, there's a big literature, some of you may be familiar with, on, should we use relative poverty lines? And I don't have time to sort of dwell on it too much, but let me just say that at the World Bank, when I was still there, actually, we introduced these 4 lines for each category of country as a kind of step function of trying to bring in some relativity. And they're not picked out of thin air. There's these 2 authors, Jolliffe and Prids. They had a database of all of the national poverty lines, okay? And they took the median poverty line for each income category. The median poverty line for the low income countries actually is 190, the same one. Amongst lower middle income countries, it's $3.20 per day per person. Amongst upper middle income countries, the national poverty lines, again, the national poverty lines, you take them and you take the median, and it's $5.50 at PPP exchange rates per person per day. And amongst high income countries, it's $21.70. Now, if you apply these lines to each country in their own classification, so if you are Ghana, you're going to get 320 as a line. If you're Uganda, you're going to get 190. If you're Germany, you're going to get 2170. If you're Brazil, you're going to get 550. Then it turns out that this relationship kind of disappears. And that is not mechanical. I mean, obviously, if you do this, I was expecting it to look flatter, but not necessarily that it actually is this flat. That's not mechanical. That's a finding that if you use these median lines, actually the burden of the pandemic in terms of poverty is much better distributed. Well, so you've got the live years and you've got the poverty years in two different ways. And that's going to give you the rest of the paper, right? That's going to give you the relative importance of these two things and then the aggregate importance. So we can then, oh, I think I have a Brazil thing here. Yeah, that's Brazil there. In terms of poverty, it's much closer to the regression line than it was in mortality, right? Mortality.
Chico,
Yeah.
what distinguishes some of these countries that are way down here that have very low poverty costs? I'm talking about the second graph. Panel
Here,
B.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there are a bunch of countries way below the line.
Yeah. Well, this one here is Belarus. Let me just say, I don't know what that is. Okay, that could be issues with the data. It could be all sorts of things. I don't
But
know.
what about what's up?
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
along there.
These ones are quite interesting. So Vietnam, Tajikistan, Norway, Malaysia, these are actually countries that had relatively low deaths, fewer deaths, and as a result had much smaller forecast contractions in October 2020. So there's this new paper by Angus Deaton, which is, you know, if all goes well, will come out in the same issue of some journal as this thing that we've just written, where he has this beautiful graph plotting GDP contractions to deaths. And the GDP contracts more where there have been more deaths. So in some aggregate sense, in some ex-post aggregate sense, that livelihoods trade-off wasn't there. If you had a lot more deaths, your economy contracted by more on average. So these countries, actually, we'll see them in a moment, but they turn out to be countries where you know, there just weren't that many deaths, and so the GDP didn't contract by that much. China's here, which is somewhat surprising, but Vietnam is here, Malaysia is here, Norway is here, Korea is here. So these basically, you know, there's two things that drive, mechanically, there's two things that drive this, right? I showed you earlier for the health, what drove the health. Mechanically, there's two things that drive this. The size of the GDP contraction, so the gap between the October and the January forecast, and, you know, just how many people are near that poverty line.
Where's Sweden? Do you see Sweden? I can't see it.
I'm looking up here because that's what I would expect it to be. But I can't see it. There's Australia. There's the US. So this is poverty, right? So in poverty terms, the US didn't do as badly as, for example.
Because Sweden had a lot of deaths because they didn't contract their economy. Maybe.
Right. I don't know where Sweden is. I know I would want to say that it's somewhere here, but I can't see it.
Okay.
All right, so moving along. So here now is, I'm going to take this figure, panel B, not panel A, okay? Because obviously, I mean, if it happens for panel B, it would happen even more for panel A. So I take panel B and I take the LYs from that first graph and I just take the ratio. So what's this ratio? This is just the ratio of poverty years lost in your country to live years lost in your country, or poverty years added in your country to live years lost in your country. PY over LY, that's all this is over here. And in some sense, so what this says is, you know, if you take the poverty burden and divide it by the mortality burden, what does it look like? And what you see is that amongst the poorer countries on the whole, this is a very high number. It goes from 100 to almost 10,000 reported, right? Or at least 1,000. I mean, Burundi and Tanzania, you know, have very suspect reporting of deaths, actually, as it turns out. But okay, I don't know what BFA is, but over here, and here's Niger, here's Rwanda. We're, about 1,000 times more years into poverty than years of life lost. Whereas if you get to the richer countries and a number of middle income countries, this is about 1. For Brazil, it's just above 1. Okay, so for each person that was moved into poverty under those assumptions that we had, you had 1 year of life lost. Not 1 death, 1 year of life lost. Okay, which is different, of course. And this is using these poverty lines. So had we used the 190 poverty line, this would, be even steeper, obviously. Okay. Now it turns out that you can compare your alpha to this number. If you answered your question, the question I asked earlier, and you said, look, I'm prepared to live 10 years in poverty for each year that you may add to my life, then your alpha is 10. Okay. And if your alpha is 10, you'd say, well, given my alpha, everything above 10 here means that the poverty is the dominant source of welfare. Even if I weigh each life year as being worth 10 years in poverty, then these guys above 10 over here, poverty was a greater source of welfare loss than mortality. Whereas below 10, all of these people here, they have such low ratios. They had so many life years lost. Given that a life year is worth 10 times a poverty year, these guys over here, mortality was the dominant source for them. Okay? So whereas my co-authors and I like to remain agnostic about the value of alpha, the value of alpha is a normative parameter that you choose, you pick, or if a policymaker wanted to pick it, we hope they would take some aggregation of alpha over the population. But here we're giving you a guidance range, we call, saying, let's say that alpha is between 10 and 30. My co-authors want this number to be a lot smaller, actually. But let's say, let's be generous. Let's say that people may be willing to spend even 30 years under these fairly strict poverty lines, okay, to get 1 more year when they are 80. That's a pretty stark trade-off. But maybe, okay. So if it's between 10 and 30, you've got up here above 30, you've got, I think it was 64 countries of the 145, for which poverty was actually a greater source of welfare loss than mortality. This includes
But Chico, you're making it sound like a choice, but this is just the ratio of basically GDP loss to deaths.
Well, not GDP loss,
but effectively GDP loss, because that's what increases poverty.
Yeah, no, it's not a choice. I don't mean to sound to say it's a choice. This is just a description. This is just a description.
So it's not like I can choose.
No, but
in my country, the USA, basically the poverty loss and the death rate are more or less the same. By the way, Sweden is pretty close. Norway, interestingly enough, is much higher. I don't understand it.
Well, it's because Norway had many, many fewer deaths.
Yeah, so that's what my point. My point is that it's really a function of policy. To me, I think your paper really, the thing that I get out of this is that this begins to give you some policy parameters, how different countries have dealt with the COVID or been able to deal with the COVID, and the kind of choices they made, in a sense.
Yeah.
Or not choices, but it's a measure of effectiveness and choices.
Yeah. But Martin, let me just say one thing. When you say it's not a choice here, let me explain a little bit better what I mean by the alpha thing, okay? So suppose the question asked of you was not what the US chose or didn't choose to do, but suppose they asked you the question, Martin, what do you think contributed most heavily to suffering or to loss of well-being in the US during the pandemic? The poverty increase or the mortality? Well, you can't answer that question unless you have some alpha in the back of your mind.
I understand that, but the fact is that it does reflect, you can say, a national choice, which is that basically the US chose
Yeah.
to have higher mortality rate and lower poverty rate.
Yeah, yeah,
Right?
right.
Because
I mean, this is in some sense, you could treat this as some sort of revealed preference of what governments did. All I'm saying, go ahead.
Yeah, in the aggregate.
Yeah. Now, of course, there are other things, that may have played a role in addition. I mean, here you do have here the Bolsonaros and the Trumps and the poor Belgians feel very bad about being in this company, but they are. Here's Russia, here's Bolivia.
Yeah, but these are
Anyway,
these are all countries that have chosen basically not to close down and allow more people to die.
Yeah. Whereas Japan and Korea and Austria
exactly.
and China, which did the opposite, are up here. Yeah.
Exactly. So these are aggregate
Yeah.
choices.
Yeah. All I'm saying is that whether you think, if you wanted to answer the question, what was worse, the mortality that happened, forget why it happened. What was worse, the mortality that happened or the poverty that happened? Well, you need a trade-off. You need a price. That price is your own internal alpha. And I'm saying if your alpha is in, whatever alpha you pick, you could draw a line here. And, those countries up here, poverty was a worse thing than mortality for those countries. And here, mortality was worse. Now, that's the relative. Let me move to the absolute. Okay. So now it's the absolute. So for the absolute, so what are we going to try to do now? So here I'm taking ratios of poverty to mortality, poverty years to life years. Now I'm going to add them. Okay. I'm going to go back to that equation at the very beginning and take it seriously. I'm going to say, okay, I don't know what utility is here. So forget about the utility metric. I'm going to look at the life years. Okay, what is my actual change in welfare? Well, it's going to depend on two things, right? It's going to clearly depend on alpha. But as we saw on this graph, it's also going to depend on your poverty lines, right? So I'm going to show you 4 figures, okay, for 2 values of alpha, these 2, 10 and 30. Okay. And then 2 constellations of poverty parameters, the 2 that I showed you before, the 190 and these 4 here. Okay. So that's what I'm gonna show you now. So I take my PYs from before and my LYs from before, and I add them up with alpha equal to 10 or alpha equal to 30, where the poverty years come either from here or from here. And I'm going to begin here and go like this. Well, I'm going to go like this actually, because of the slope. You're going to see what's happening to the slope. The point is the slope. Okay. So here is weekly relative lines and alpha 30. So this means I'm allowing poverty to go up quite a bit in rich countries too, because I'm using a higher poverty line for them. And I'm also valuing life years a lot. A life year is worth 30 poverty years here. Well, even so, my expectation, given the massive poverty impacts over here, my expectation was that this thing was not going to look like this. What this says is that actually the pandemic's welfare distribution is that upper middle income and high income countries suffered more than poor countries. You see, this upward sloping thing is telling you that aggregate welfare losses measured in poverty years are greater amongst these countries than amongst these countries. Okay. But you say, well, that's alpha 30. These people, they died a lot. A lot of them died because they were old and you're giving them a lot of weight. So let's go to 10. Well, it's still, obviously it became flatter, right? But it's still the case. I mean, it doesn't really change. I mean, you've got Peru over here and Belgium and the US and Brazil, and they are still up there. And these guys are less, okay? Then I said, look, guys, okay, let's just take Z equal to 190, okay? Take Z equal to 190, this was the figure you had with Z equal to 190, okay? Massive poverty differences, much, much higher poverty amongst poorer countries. So let's take Z equal to 190. Oh, before that, I just wanted to show you some numbers. So this, I quite like this one of the 4 graphs, and I'll just give you some numbers here, okay? So this is numbers of years. Remember, the life years are multiplied by 10, okay? So this is 10 times life years plus PYs. That's what you should read. This is a number of PYs. The number of PYs ranges in this figure from 424 in Vietnam per 100,000 people to 22,000 in Peru. So first thing to notice is that the welfare burden of the pandemic was very unequally distributed across countries, although perhaps not as you'd expect. Some countries did much better. And here is actually the figure, Martin, where you know, I like looking for the countries that you were looking for before. Because before it was relative. Here's absolute. So absolute, you know, China, Korea, Norway, Australia, Japan, even though Japan is the oldest of all countries in terms of above 65s, they have much lower welfare losses than the US, Belgium, France, Britain, Peru, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and so on. Okay. Anyway, okay, now let's go to Z190. With alpha 30, that's still an upward sloping line. Even though now we know that the poverty years in these countries have gone to almost zero, because poverty years are now at 190. Even though I'm using an absolute constant poverty line, welfare losses from the pandemic are still greater on average among richer countries than among poorer countries. This really is just that, right? It is the fact that life years lost were a great deal greater amongst richer countries than amongst poorer countries. It must be, because we know the poverty years look like this if I'm looking at 190. Okay, so it is. I have to say, I found this, it's entirely not what I was expecting. Okay.
Chico, why don't you control for the average age?
Well, I don't want to control for the average age. I want the welfare losses.
I know,
the welfare.
That's true. That's true, but it would be interesting to see what happens, because I'm viewing your calculations from a self-interest point of view, and what I want to find out from them. But if you're trying to measure welfare loss, so you're not interested in average age because it is what it is. Yeah. But if you're interested in sort of these aggregate, implicit, you know, sort of choices that countries made, which I think these data give you a lot of information about, then controlling for the average age gives you more the choice variable rather than things they didn't control. They didn't control average age. It is what it is. So that gives you a different perspective. I just like that. I like the idea that if you control for the average age, then you're telling me, oh, US really was very afraid of increasing the poverty level. So it said, okay, we're going to let a lot of people die. And in fact, this is what happened last year. This is pretty much what happened. I mean, there's no reason for the US to have such a high mortality rate, but people, between the choices people made and what the government did, that's what we got.
Oh, and here you can see, so let me come back to this question, Martin. It's a very good one at the end, but just to show you here you can see Sweden quite clearly together with the US and Belgium and Luxembourg here at the very top, and the Netherlands. But just to continue with my slope, okay, so I was trying to get the slope to go down. Well, I do manage somehow with alpha equals 10. So now I'm still using the 190. And now my trade-off is, okay, a year of life is worth 10 years in poverty, not 30. This is still statistically significant, but it's much flatter now, okay? And then just so you see, okay, I'm gonna take alpha a notch down, as far down as I'm willing to go, my co-authors notwithstanding, which is alpha 5. Okay? If alpha equals 5, so that is to say, you think a life year is worth 5 poverty years only. Then with the weekly relative poverty lines, that's still an upward sloping line, but with 190, that's finally now a downward sloping line. So that is to say, whether or not you think welfare losses from the pandemic were primarily amongst poor or rich countries, depends on the poverty line you use and on the trade-off between mortality and poverty in your head. You know, it depends on the normative trade-off between years of life lost and poverty years. And if you're willing to value a life year at, you know, something like 5 poverty years or thereabouts, then you do get the poor countries suffer more than rich countries. Otherwise, you know, for values of alpha above 5, and if you want a sort of relative poverty line rather than an absolute one, the welfare losses were greater in rich countries. Okay, so let me end that two slides to end, and then we open up if there's any time left for discussion. So what do we take away from this? It's a very descriptive paper. What do we take away? First, the mortality burden. So the first 2 points are about the ingredients, right? The building blocks. The mortality burden of COVID is borne disproportionately by richer countries. As I showed you, that's because richer countries are older and the virus is highly age selective. They're older and they have life, you know, higher residual life expectancy. But basically, it's because these countries are older. This is a virus that kills older people. So the mortality burden is borne disproportionately by richer countries. The poverty burden is borne disproportionately by poorer countries at constant, but not at the weekly relative poverty line. Then the two most important conclusions for us. This is what we take away from the relative discussion, okay, that figure. What we take away from that figure is you can't ignore poverty when you talk about welfare losses from the pandemic. Yes, it's primarily a health crisis, but you know, increases in poverty around the world were very significant. And even if you value a poverty year very little, even if you say a life year is 30 times a poverty year, poverty is the dominant source of welfare loss in 64 countries of 145. If you go down to 10, then that number is 83 countries where poverty was a more important source of welfare loss than mortality in that country. When we look at the aggregate welfare losses, they tend to be higher for wealthier countries, except the only way I can reverse that is if I use constant, very low, extreme poverty lines of 190 and a relative price of a life year that is, in my mind, low, of 5. Okay. Otherwise, the welfare losses are greater in richer countries. Some caveats. These findings hinge on the accurate reporting of COVID mortality, of course. Okay? And we know that these are measured with error, and it's possible that the error varies across countries. If low-income countries are underreporting by much more than richer countries, then both of our findings will change. The pandemic isn't over yet, regardless of measurement error. Even if there was no measurement error, when historians or economists look at it 2 or 3 years from now, it could be quite different because we don't know how mortality and poverty will be distributed in 2021, particularly with different expansion paths for the vaccine across rich and poor countries. Right? Third, social protection responses are largely ignored in our analysis. So, you know, I just took GDP forecasts and I shift the distributions up or down, but of course there were big stimulus programs, there was big redistribution. The most recent papers on Brazil suggest that poverty actually fell in Brazil in 2020, remarkably enough, because of the very large auxílio de emergência, the emergency payments. So these, and you know, whereas in Mexico, there were no emergency payments of any kind. So there, our forecasts are probably much more reasonable. So once data on the social protection responses becomes more available, you could refine this very substantially. Okay, and it will change for some countries. The overall pattern may not change, but it will change for some countries. Okay. Finally, you know, these figures, in my mind, do not necessarily mean, oh, globally, you know, a benevolent global dictator, if there were such a thing, should worry most about rich countries. I don't think it means that because, you know, our welfare analysis was completely utilitarian. We didn't have any aversion to initial inequality. We are treating here a loss of delta X to Niger as the same as a lot of delta X to the US. Of course, you may value it's much higher for Niger because it's got a lower income. And so if you did that, then priorities or rankings would be different from what is implied by this. And then finally, what's not on the screen, because it's not a caveat, but I just want to say it, is in response to Martin's question, it's not a response, but a comment on Martin's comment is, one of our referees on the first paper said, well, why don't you take these things and regress them against a whole bunch of policy variables and controls? And I think that's, Martin, what you were getting at, is if I have some number, for example, these numbers here, these aggregate welfare losses, I could regress them against not only average age in the country, but there is a measure out there of the intensity of lockdown. And if I had that measure, apparently that's in some database, and if it's believable, the coefficient on that would tell you a lot about these countries that we were talking about earlier. So that's something we may do in future research, but we haven't had time so far. So let me end there. Maybe I'll stop sharing just so I can see you guys again. If we need to go back, I'll share again. But thank you very much for listening.